I did not include the information about my how to get my book and that kind of thing. And I'll let you decide if and how you want to share that, but people are welcome to reach out to me individually.
Yeah, so I'll share it in the chat like right when we end, and then I'll also put it in the email when I send out certificates as well. So
okay, great, thank you.
Yeah, of course. All right, so we have our participants filtering in right now. So I just want to go through some of the continuing education stuff and welcome you guys to our presentation today. So today we have Jenny Mills, who is going to be talking about the stages of change in responding to readiness. She's a really wonderful presenter. I've seen her present before, and this is such a great topic. My name is Ashley Loftus. I work with the Addiction Prevention Coalition, and I handle all the continuing education stuff here at APC. So I'll be the one sending out your certificates, and if you have any questions, I'll be the person that you reach out to. So first, I just want to go through just our approval that we have. We are approved by the Alabama Board of Social Work, the NBCC for 2 contact hours, and then the Alabama Board of Nursing for 2.4 contact hours. All right, so at the end of this webinar, what you're going to do is you're going to complete an evaluation. So I will drop the link to the evaluation in the chat box, and then on Zoom, Zoom should actually pop up a post attendee page that should take you directly to the evaluation. So you'll be able to access the evaluation 2 different ways. At the end of the evaluation, which I'll show you guys in just a minute, there should be a page that says request continuing education credits. So if you need continuing education credits, what you are going to do is click on that, put in the information that it requests, which is just like your license number, if you need social work hours, NBCC hours, or nursing board hours. And then I will get the certificates to you within 7 business days. So 7 business days from now is October 11th. APC has had several continuing education events happen over the past couple of weeks. So we are working to get through all those certificates. And then you see the CE at APC BHAM email if you guys have any questions. And I'll put that in the chat as well. All right, so as I was just discussing, this is what the end of the evaluation will look like. And this is where you will go to click on the link to request continuing education credits. All right, and here are the upcoming trainings that we have over the next 3 weeks. On October 7th, which is next week, we'll have one on harm reduction. Then that'll be followed by substance use disorders in the family, substance use in adolescents, prevention and treatment. If you're interested in any of those, you can go to Eventbrite, which is where you registered for this event, and you can register for these as well. And then here are all of our partners that have worked so hard to put this event together. The Drug Education Council at Mobile, Alabama, Not One More in Huntsville, Alabama, CAPI, which is through UAB Medicine, and then of course the Addiction Prevention Coalition. So that is all I have. So Jenny, you have the floor.
All right, well, it's a pleasure to get to meet everybody today. If I had my druthers, I would be in front of you in person. Ironically, we anticipated doing this talk in somewhere around the 3rd week of March of 2020. So needless to say, the world shut down on March the 13th of last year. And so that event was canceled. And so instead of being present with you in Alabama and in front of you, able to move and engage and operate like I normally do, I am in a situation where I am talking to a screen and I can't see you. So there's a part of me that feels really uncomfortable with that, and a part that would much rather engage with you in person. However, I'm also grateful for the opportunity to meet with you today without having to go to Alabama, because I have a new baby granddaughter in my life. And so I am able to take some time off right now to spend with her, and we'll be able to wrap up with you guys today and then jot across a couple of neighborhoods over and go spend the afternoon with her. So thank you, Ashley, for welcoming me and for the opportunity to present. And I agree that I really want folks to be able to stop and ask questions along the way. I tend to be an engaged presenter, so that will feel good for me, not distracting or disruptive. And so let's go ahead and get started, and we will stop along the way. We'll also take a break at about the 12 o'clock mark, the 12 o'clock mark your time, in order to give folks a little bit of a break. So we're talking today about the stages of change, particularly in the parent-child relationship when substance use disorder and recovery is a part of the story. As Ashley shared, my name is Jenny Mills. I'm the founder, CEO, and author of Full Life Counseling and Recovery, which is my brick and mortar practice, Parenting Through Addiction, which is a parent education and support community that supports parents all over the country. And I'm fortunate enough to have some of my information in print through the book, Parenting Through Your Adult Child's Addiction, Making Sense of Treatment, Aftercare, and Recovery Recommendations. And so at the end of our time together, Ashley will provide you information for accessing some of those resources so that you have an opportunity to explore more the ways in which I try specifically to help parents on this journey of addiction and recovery with their adult children. So, as with any good continuing education program, we have some very distinctive learning objectives. And so we want to begin by reviewing the stages of change and the trans-theoretical model of change. We want to validate differences between parent readiness and the readiness for change by a son or daughter affected by addiction, because there is a huge difference. I want to be sure that you can identify at least 3 appropriate actions that parents can take independent of the readiness of their son or daughter's readiness for change. I also want to make sure that you are introduced to sort of a simplified version of stages of change, with 3 distinctive changes of the stages of the parent-child relationship through addiction into recovery, and the appropriate parental responses in each stage. But if I'm honest, my own goals or wishes or hopes for today are to really help you think differently about the stages of change when it comes specifically to the disease of addiction and how that disease affects the parent-child relationship. And while it might sound like I'm only referencing parents of adolescents or young adults, I'm really talking about the experience of parenting through addiction for parents with sons or daughters of any age. So, I lead a parent education and support meeting every Thursday with parents from all over the country. And right now, our representation is for parents of children 19 to 46, I believe. And so, even though the parent of the 46-year-old is in a very different place than the parent of the 19-year-old, some of their challenges and the stages of change through which they're going as a family are really the same, even though their children are very different ages. So even though it sounds like I'm mostly talking about adolescents or young adults, I'm really not. It could apply to anybody. I really want you to think differently about denial and resistance to treatment. And I want you to think differently about the power that parents do have and do not have to help their sons or daughters affected by addiction. I am a storyteller. Ashley was present when I presented at the Bradford conference a few years ago. I like to use stories and pictures and relatable experiences to give you language to help the parents that you encounter in your work as counselors so that you can really empower them to act on their own readiness for change. So I like to use stories and pictures and relatable experiences to teach. So you'll get that from me a lot today. So let's start with a picture of how I learned about readiness. This is a picture of the real Virginia. So my name is Jenny and my given name is Virginia, but that is the real Virginia. She is my grandmother. We called her Mama Jen. And as far as I knew, she smoked cigarettes every day of her life. I'm sure she didn't smoke them as a child, but every day of my life, she smoked cigarettes. And I can remember being a child and my cousins and I would say, Mama Jen, don't you think it's time you quit smoking? And she'd look at us and she'd say, well, why would I want to quit smoking? I like to smoke. Why would I want to make that change? She had no interest in changing. She was not ready to change. On the other hand, this little girl is my daughter, Holly. She happens to be a person in her own recovery. She's about 5.5 years sober, but in this picture, she had just been born a whopping 18 days late. She had been prepared to come into this world in February, but she did not make her arrival until March the 9th. And we knew that there was an eventuality to her arrival, even though we couldn't force it to happen. Now, you know, we do the things that you do, and eventually there was an emergency C-section, but relatively speaking, there was an eventuality of change that could be expected. And when we are working with sons and daughters and people who are affected by addiction, we know that there will be an eventuality of a crisis that will come that creates an opportunity for change. And last but not least, I learned in my very first job out of undergraduate school about the power of delusional thinking. This terrible building with this beautiful wreath of hope in the secured play yard, so to speak, is the criminal or the forensic unit at the now closed Dorothea Dix Hospital in Raleigh, North Carolina. This building, this hospital was built literally in the 1800s and served as the state psychiatric hospital or state mental hospital for the state of North Carolina until about 10 years ago. And it was working in the criminal unit at Dorothea Dix as a lowly social worker one, all of 22 years old, that I learned about the power of delusion. That those with serious thought disorders who believe things that are obviously not true to the clear mind cannot be talked out of their delusion. It is simply so real for them that there is no logic, no reasoning, no presentation of evidence that is sufficient to get them to break that delusion. And that's pretty important too in helping me shape my understanding of readiness. So let's move quickly through a review of the original stages of change, or the trans-theoretical model of change that Prochaska and DiClemente presented back in 1977. They really recognized 5 stages of change: pre-contemplative, contemplative, preparation, action, and maintenance. So if we go back to Mama Jen and her relationship with cigarettes, when she was in the pre-contemplation, or the blue circle here, Mama Jen had absolutely no inkling of making change because she saw no problem. She liked what she was doing. She saw no reason to make change. And there was therefore no thought or intention part of her conscious awareness. On the other hand, Let's just say, for grins and giggles, that maybe she began to experience some pretty complicated issues with her breathing. And she has an appointment and the doctor says, Virginia, I know that you really like your cigarettes, but I'm really worried that your smoking is contributing to your breathing problems. And I really hope you'll give some thought to exploring ways to quit. That might have been enough, because there was some distress and a recommendation from a professional, that might have been enough to move her into a contemplation of change. But contemplation is by default simply thought. To contemplate is to think about something, but it doesn't necessarily involve any explicit action. So she might have contemplated the idea, but not having done anything, but not do anything about it. On the other hand, if a few months later, after a few rounds of being admitted to the hospital and being put on oxygen, the doctor says, Virginia, I know you really don't want to quit smoking, but we're at a crossroads here. You really are going to need to make a decision to either stop smoking or go on full-time portable oxygen. That might have been disruptive enough in her life to not want to do that. Now, she was a pretty down-to-earth person in many ways, as you could tell by that picture. On the other hand, she absolutely would have detested the idea of carrying around a portable oxygen tank on her shoulder all the time so she could breathe. So that might have been enough to get her moving from thinking about change to preparing for change, which has a degree of action involved with it as well. Perhaps eventually getting to the place where she agrees to accept the prescription, she agrees to get some support, she agrees to get some Nicorette gum and to stop smoking cigarettes in hopes that she can maintain a lifestyle without nicotine or cigarettes or tobacco in it. But drugs and alcohol complicate the stages of change model. And so Bill Miller and Stephen Rolnick expanded that to identify a sixth stage, a stage called relapse. And their assumption was that with relapse as the sixth stage of change, the user regresses all the way back to a pre-contemplative stage of change. And so now that sequence of pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation, action, and maintenance is interrupted or set back by a lapse or relapse. And the suggestion is that puts somebody back in that place of not wanting to change because there's no reason to change. Sometimes I say that the very worst thing that can happen from a relapse is that there's a life-changing disaster. Somebody runs over a 2-year-old or pawns their grandmother's wedding ring and they can never get it back. An incident happens that there will be lasting change or lasting shame and guilt as a result of a relapse. That's the worst thing that can happen. The second worst thing that can happen is nothing. Because if nothing happens, then the individual is much more likely to think, oh, this was all an exaggeration. I really don't need to do all this. See, I can use it not turn into a disaster. They were giving me a hard time. Turns out, after all, now that I've sort of had a reset, maybe I can return to safe use. And so that's where Miller and Rolnick landed in terms of thinking about the relapse taking somebody back to pre-contemplation. On the other hand, we've learned a lot since then. We now recognize that not all relapses or returns to use necessarily result in that full regression to pre-contemplation. Learning can actually happen and impact a response to a return to use. And so now we recognize that there are reasons to be hopeful that a healthy, prompt response to a relapse or a return to use can actually strengthen recovery instead of weaken it. And that's something that I think we as therapists and addiction professionals have needed to sort of get over that hurdle, because we talk out of both sides of our mouth. We say relapse is a part of recovery, and we discourage people from thinking that it's never going to happen. But when it happens, we join in the masses sometimes, and we join in with the parents as seeing it as a disaster, when in fact it can be an opportunity for learning how to prevent the next relapse. And so now, instead of the simple pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation, action, maintenance, and relapse, there's a recognition of an upward spiral, that each relapse can result in some degree of learning. And human development complicates things too. Young people are naturally inclined to be pre-contemplative because they are hardwired to detach from their parents and gravitate towards their peers. That's who they want to look to for insight and recommendations and guidance in their decision-making. They don't want to listen to parents. They want to take risks, and they want to be grown-ups. And so engaging in adult behaviors, including but not limited to alcohol and drug use, is part of the way they practice or try on grown-up activities. And yet, when they do, their emotional maturation is slowed down or paused. Their brain development is compromised. This is especially true with marijuana. And their cultivation of a broad array of coping skills is sort of paused or halted, because in fact, what they discovered is they found their Swiss Army knife. They found the tool that helps them feel good and not feel bad. And therefore it becomes the tool they use for everything. A multi-purpose tool became their drug. So parents respond to substance use with fear. And as they get more afraid, they try to exert control over choices and behavior, and they argue with each other. They end up regressing and becoming less willing to allow their child to learn through failure and consequence, because the stakes seem so much higher. And the more parents try to control, the more young people exercise their hardwired instincts to detach and individuate. So it just gets worse. So when those problems actually start to happen, parents get really action ready, but that doesn't mean their kids are. When there is a problem that is really caused by substance use, young people say, it's not a big deal. Everybody does it. Shoot, even you even did it. You're trying to run my life, stay out of it. Get out of my life. But parents are afraid, and fear is a motivator for parents to really get pushy and demanding. They don't want it to become a big deal, so they want to encourage their child to make changes before it does become a big deal. They also want to exert the authority in their household to say, as long as you live under our roof, you'll do as we say, or they'll be held to pay if you don't. And so parents want to get more authoritative, authoritarian, demanding, controlling, because they're afraid. And it's easy to understand why they're afraid, because they as parents have a perspective and a recognition of how things can get out of control that their younger children do not have. Parents are very ready for change at this point. They're gung-ho, which is exactly why we're talking today more about parents' readiness than their child's readiness, because parents may be action ready a long time before their son or daughter gets action ready. Now, when there are problems, the child may not always see it, and they don't see a problem, therefore they're not ready to make change. But when there is a problem that they recognize, they aren't necessarily really ready to make change, but they can get more agreeable, because they sort of recognize that they've got their comeuppance, that they are at a place where they're not going to be able to get away with doing nothing. And so they're kind of like, okay, fine, let's do this. but I'm going to do this my way. I'm not going to do it your way, but I'll do something. Sure. Yeah. So they're not really ready, but they are willing to take some steps, which is encouraging. So what's a self-respecting counselor to do to help families like these? Here's a hint. I really want to invite you to honor the stages of change model by meeting each person where they are. And more today, again, we're going to talk about the ways to meet parents where they are in light of where their children are. So as tempting as it may be, I really want to invite you to fight the temptation to say these dreaded words. Here we go. I'm so sorry, but there's really nothing you can do until your son or daughter is ready for help. I really want to recommend you go to Al-Anon and wait for him to hit bottom, but that could take years. We've all said it. We've all heard it. It is the conventional wisdom. So why is it that I don't want you to say it? Because I don't really think it's the truth. Parents can't control their children's choices, behavior, or their response to alcohol or drugs, but they have a great deal of ability to take action and make changes of their own. And so when we say to parents, there's nothing you can do, that is simply not true. So we're going to talk today specifically about what parents can do regardless of where their sons or daughters are in this continuum or stages of change. It's like telling a pregnant couple that they can't do anything to prepare for labor, delivery, or parenthood. So, I have a daughter who has a baby who's 17 days old, and she certainly did a lot to prepare for labor and delivery and to have some idea of what to expect in parenthood. And the same is true for parents who have a son or daughter who's using substances. So here's a great quote from Chrissy Positek, who wrote the book, The Parallel Process, which a lot of treatment programs use as a recommended reading for parents while their sons or daughters are in treatment. Chrissy says, from the outset, it should be understood that parents cannot make their child change. They can't make it all better. What they can do in the meantime is to become more self-aware and shift their responses and relate differently to their teen. So parents can be helped through a parallel process with the help of counselors like you and like me. But perhaps the biggest complication of all of this is that substance use can lead to the development of a true brain disease. I cannot emphasize enough how much a variable this is, this concept of a true brain disease. For a lot of people, substance use starts off as an experiment and it progresses into a pattern of behavior, but it doesn't necessarily translate into the same reaction or the same experience for everybody. If it progresses to addiction, then the standard parenting strategies of reward and punishment generally don't work in creating sustainable or genuine behavior change. As the brain changes in response to the addiction, many things change, especially in the brain, and some things stay the same, also including in the brain, perhaps for years to come. So we're not just talking about the readiness to make change and sustain changes in regular behavior. We're talking about the expectation that somebody with a brain disease is ready to make and sustain changes in their behavior when their brain no longer works the way it's supposed to. Let's say that last part again. We're expecting them to understand the need to make change and the willingness to do it when their brain doesn't work the way it's supposed to anymore. Now, they had every intention of getting high. They had no intention of developing a brain disease. And this particular brain disease creeps up on you in a way that you don't even appreciate that you've sort of crossed the line. Sometimes I refer to that line or that point of no return as being like an unmarked Canadian border crossing in the snow and the fog and the dark. You can know that you're at risk for crossing from Montana into Canada. But if you knew where the line was and you knew you couldn't come back across it, because addiction is, after all, a chronic, progressive, potentially fatal disease that can be treated but cannot be cured, if you knew that if you crossed that line into Canada that you could never come back, you wouldn't cross the line. People intend to get high. Nobody intends to create a brain disease or to use their way into a brain disease. And when that brain disease has been established, their brain no longer works the way it's supposed to. This distinction is really important. So let's talk about your own experiences. If we were in a room together, I would engage you in a little physical activity by asking you to consider your own experiences with trying to make change and sustain those changes in our behavior. So if I were to say, of the people in the room, if you have ever attempted to start and maintain a new exercise regimen, but then fell back into living a more sedentary lifestyle, stand up. If I were to say, if you've ever tried to quit smoking, but went back, stand up. If you've ever lost weight and gained it back, stand up. If you've ever made and broken a New Year's resolution, stand up. If you've ever tried to make changes in how you handle your email or the paper in your house, or whether you make your bed or are engaged in a regular pattern of self-care, but fell off the wagon and went back to the old way of doing things, stand up. If we were in the room together, by the time we got to the end of that, my guess is everybody in the room would be standing, because behavior change is something we all try to do from time to time, but we find it really hard to sustain. And so if we're trying to sustain those behaviors as people without a brain disease and we can't do it, imagine what it would be like if our brains didn't work right. Imagine how hard it would be if there's some part of us that says, oh, don't do that. That behavior change is going to make you feel like you're dying. That behavior change is going to make you feel like you're at the bottom of the ocean and someone just turned off your air. I'm a scuba diver, and so the idea of turning off somebody's air at the bottom of the ocean is one that I think resonates with a lot of people when they're trying to get sober, because that's exactly what it feels like. If you take away my Swiss Army knife, if you take away my tool for feeling better and for not feeling terrible, it feels like taking my oxygen away. Understanding that this is a brain disease with people whose brains don't work right is part of what makes this experience so different when working with families affected by addiction. So the distinction is important. Those changes are hard enough to make, but imagine trying to stay motivated for change when there's a brain disease that affects your behavior and motor functioning, your perception of reality, including knowing who to trust or distrust, knowing who is friend and who is foe, decision-making skills, emotional responses, the ability to predict outcome and assess risk before taking action, the ability to experience pleasure, to be able to remember the things that you need, to be able to get quality sleep, both in terms of quantity and quality of sleep. Sleep is restorative, and sleep is compromised with addiction and recovery. And for the person with addiction, thinking becomes perseverated and behaviors become compulsive. Everything about the experience of walking through life is complicated when there is a brain disease of addiction. There are literally changes in the brain, the organ inside the skull, dopamine pathways, serotonin pathways, GABA, endorphins, norepinephrine, all of those pathways and production and reuptake is compromised by drug use. Nora Volkow says that the limbic system, this part right here in the very middle, the limbic system, or the reptilian part of the brain, is controlling everything. The prefrontal cortex, where we make good decisions and delay gratification and organize our lives and fulfill our responsibilities, that part of the brain is practically offline, like when somebody loses internet. And so the limbic system is that part of the brain that I can recognize as being fully developed, even with my, less than 1 month old granddaughter. She knows what feels good. She knows when she is uncomfortable, and she knows how to get people to hop to it to make her feel better. And in many respects, that's exactly how the person with the disease of addiction encounters life. They find themselves experiencing a kind of urgency to feel good and not feel bad as efficiently and as quickly as possible. And the truth of the matter is, drugs accomplish that. Drugs and alcohol work to change the way a person is feeling as it relates to rewards and pain and discomfort. And so we know that the organ inside the brain is literally changed. Parents, we hope, do not have that brain disease. Now, let's be clear. I recognize that many of the parents that we work with may also have their own alcoholism or their own addiction. But relatively speaking, for the purposes of our discussion today, we're going to say that the sons or daughters may have a brain disease called addiction, but we hope that their parents don't. And so that means that that those sons and daughters need their parents to be able to think more clearly, make better decisions, and take actions when they're ready, until the son or daughter is able to do it for themselves. Those sons and daughters need their parents to be able to have some balance of compassion and determination, just like they did when they would take them for infant or preschool immunizations. This is one of those little word pictures I want you to get in your head, that when we have, infants or preschoolers who need an immunization, and obviously immunizations and vaccinations are all in the news right now. When our children were little, we recognized that they were going to cry, they were going to be afraid, they were going to resist and fight following through with those immunizations once they knew they were coming, because they were little and it hurt and they were scared. But we as parents insisted on getting those immunizations anyway, at the same time that we practiced a tremendous amount of compassion. Yes, we would let them wear their pajamas to the doctor's office, or take their lovey, or maybe even their passy. We would let them get a Batman or a Powerpuff Girl Band-Aid, and we would promise to take them out for ice cream after. We would cuddle and comfort and soothe, but we got the shot. We did not let their resistance and their fear and their determination to not get the shot interfere with our determination to get them the help that they needed. My younger daughter, the one that just had the baby, she required the super nurse. We went through 3 nurses before we got to the super nurse, and it was very clear that it was going to require someone who had this perfect balance of compassion and determination. And by golly, we got the shots. It was over before she knew it, and we walked out and went to get the ice cream. So children who have a brain disease need their parents to practice that same level of compassion and determination, just like they did when they were younger. But because they're so big, parents are more inclined to back off or feel like they don't have the capacity to insist on getting the services, and they can't make the services happen, but they can be determined in their response to their children's behavior. And we're going to talk a little bit more about how to do that later. Those children need their parents to not give in to their emotional manipulation and instead to have the courage to make hard decisions, set and enforce firm boundaries, and help them get the help they need as soon as they're ready. Those children with that brain disease need these things from their parents, and they need their parents to learn about the brain disease, about recovery, and about how to determine their child's readiness for change and to respond accordingly. That's what children with addiction, whether they are 17 or 47, need from their parents. So I want to simplify these concepts of stages of change by breaking them down into three categories specifically for those who are parenting through addiction. So I want to talk about what it's like to parent a delusional child, a cherry-picking child, or a child in partnership in the pursuit of recovery. So my hope had been that I'd be able to share a clip for you, and Ashley and I made a well-intentioned attempt to be able to let me share a clip from the movie A Beautiful Mind. A Beautiful Mind, yes, took me a minute. This is the story of John Nash, who was a genius mathematician and economist who developed schizophrenia. And just like those patients that I had when I was a social worker one at Dorothea Dix in the forensic unit, John Nash experienced delusions that seemed so real to him that it never occurred to him that they were not real. In the clip I wanted to show you, but that we can't make work on Zoom, he is studying on the quad at his university. And he is engaged in problem solving, and he is approached by a little girl. And the little girl talks to him and acknowledges that her uncle told him not to be worried if he wasn't very nice to her, that sometimes his mind didn't work quite right. And then the uncle, who is his roommate, approaches him. And we are observing this very seemingly natural encounter between a college student and his roommate's niece, only to later in the story come to appreciate that neither the roommate nor the niece are real. In the scene that I wanted to show you, there's a point where the little girl runs around the quad. And she's running on an area where there are all these pigeons that have lit down in the grass. And when she runs through the pigeons, guess what? None of them move because she's not real. The pigeons don't respond to something that's not real, but John Nash certainly believes that she's there. There's no amount of convincing John Nash that the roommate and the niece are not real, because in his mind, they really are. For those in the pre-contemplative stage of change who have the brain disease of addiction, they are delusional, similar to but different from those with schizophrenia. They believe that their use of substances is not only not problematic, even if there's ample evidence that use is causing problems, they actually think that the drugs, the friends, the drug dealers are actually more trustworthy, more helpful, that they are good, and that parents, teachers, counselors, and other mentors are bad because they are interfering with the opportunity for them to be able to use the way they want. They believe that all their problems aren't a result of their substance use, but rather a result of other people's reactions to their substance use. They're in a delusional stage of change where they see absolutely no reason to make change because drugs and alcohol are the solution, not the problem, and therefore it's something to be protected. If you've seen A Beautiful Mind, you know that John Nash is secretive about his work. He is secretive about the problems that he is trying to solve in the shed behind the house, where he works with the man in the black suit and the black hat, because he is protecting it, because it's important to him. It not only never occurs to him that it might not be real, but he's going to go to any lengths to protect it because it's important to him. Rewards and internal consequences within a household tend to be pretty ineffective in creating true behavior change for parents and their children with addiction when they are in this delusional or pre-contemplative stage of change. As counselors, we can support parents of those in that delusional stage of change because we want to help those children be ready. We want to help those parents be ready to insist that their son or daughter gets an assessment and sees a counselor just a few times. So again, this is tying back to something that they may have experienced before. I want to introduce the just humor me line. So if a mother were to see a big old ooky mole on a child's back, or even a 45-year-old son, she might say, that doesn't look right to me. That looks like it could be cancerous. And the son or daughter might say, yeah, it's nothing. It's been there forever. Don't worry about it. But she, as the mother, might say, look, just humor me. I don't know whether that's something to worry about or not, but if it is, we want to do something about it. Are you willing to see a doctor just to humor me, and let's see if there's something to worry about? So we can help empower parents to insist that their sons or daughters take a step or two just to humor them. And most sons or daughters, even if they're delusional, will do that simply to get their parents off their back. They may not have any intention of making change, but they might be willing to do that just to get the parents to back off. Parents need to be able to model willingness to get help by seeing a counselor for themselves, and they need to be able to get active in practicing self-care and finding a tribe of support for themselves and a place to learn. Maybe that's through parents of addicted loved ones or parenting through addiction, but they need to find a place for support. We need to help parents recommit to the parental responses of allowing natural consequences to occur. When children were little, we would let them fall down on their bike because we knew that they had to do that and practice with failure in order to learn. But when the stakes get high with substance use, parents suddenly become unwilling to let children learn from their mistakes. And we want to invite them to recommit to allowing natural consequences to happen, eliminating enabling behaviors, and still showing compassion when their child is upset because of those consequences. If the child fell down on the bicycle, we would still offer comfort. And when problems start happening that produce upsetness for a child affected by substance use, parents don't want to demonstrate compassion because they feel like they brought it on themselves. They want them to hurt. And yet their child needs to hear that they can have compassion for that distress, even if they're not rescuing them from it. And that's the key. Don't rescue, but still stay engaged and hold compassion. Avoid long lectures, emotional pleadings, rewards, or rescue. They don't work. We want parents to get their needs for emotional venting somewhere else. We know that, parents get mad and scared and infuriated and they need to vent, but it's not going to be helpful if they vent to their child because that just makes the child pull away more. We need to help them find ways to get those needs met elsewhere. And maybe last, but certainly not least, as long as there's no danger, we want to encourage parents to wait for some degree of readiness for change. And we're going to talk about the danger element a little bit later. But we really want to encourage parents to hold off on pulling the trigger to, push somebody into treatment if they aren't really ready, if there's no immediate danger. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. When we are helping those action-ready parents, We want to help them require their child to get 4 to 6 sessions of motivational interviewing, but no more. That's about what they can commit to. We need to give them honest information about realistic expectations. Let's face it, folks, we are vulnerable. And I want to pause. I want to stop the screen share for a minute because I think this is really important. We are prone as counselors to buy into a parent's desire for their son or daughter to get counseling, but we aren't always honest about what they can expect from that. Let's face it, if a kid is, and I say kid, again, kid of any age, if a kid is getting 8 to 12 hours of sleep a night, if a kid is working or going to school 40 hours a week, if a kid is engaged in some additional purposeful and productive activity and seeing me for an individual session once or twice a week, that still leaves over 50 hours, 50 waking hours a week for them to decide not to get high. So let's be honest with parents and acknowledge that meeting with us for an hour or 2 a week is not a realistic expectation to move their child from pre-contemplation to action. It is just a lie and it's misleading. And so I think we owe it to the parents that we're working with to say, your child is not really action ready, and there are a few things that we can do to help sort of prime the pump. We call that motivational interviewing. Prime the pump to see if we can't help them make some transition out of pre-contemplation and into contemplation, or out of contemplation and into preparation. But we're not going to be able to move your child from pre-contemplation to action for them to suddenly decide, oh, I don't know what I was thinking. I definitely need to stop getting high. That's not going to happen. And we owe it to parents to not mislead them otherwise. And so I think that's part of what we owe the parents that we're working with. We need to help them recognize that the focus of that motivational interviewing is to help their child increase self-awareness outside the power struggle with their parents. And that while it may, that counselor may invite them to experiment with a trial of abstinence and to process what that's like, it's not likely to be something that the son or daughter chooses to sustain. We also want to encourage parents to invite their child to open up a little bit about what their experiences are like of being in a substance using culture. And that means being able to listen without lecturing, admonishing, shaming, or threatening in response to what that son or daughter shares. If we want our children to be able to talk to us, if parents want their children to open up, parents have to be able to respond by listening and not judging and reacting. Parents need to strive to allow their children to experience unencumbered consequences of their action, and again, demonstrating compassion for their suffering that they experience as a result. And last but not least, parents need the opportunity to put out the opportunity for that child to continue working with the counselor if they choose. Because if the child bought into the 4 to 6 sessions with the counselor just to appease the parent, and it went okay, if the parent now changes the rules and says, okay, I'm glad you went to the 4 to 6 sessions, now I want you to keep going. It's like, hey, you did the shell game on me. You said 4 to 6 sessions. I did my part. Screw you, I'm not going back. Well, if the process went okay and the parent puts it out there as an option but not a requirement, that might actually improve the likelihood that the kid or the son or daughter stays engaged in services. And if so, that would be a good thing. But the power of choice improves that likelihood, and that is something that's within the parent's control to offer. When we are working with the parents themselves, though, what is it that we want to convey when they are in the delusion, when their child is in the delusional stage of change? We want them to work with a counselor long enough to start to really grasp some key concepts about development, addiction, and recovery. We want them to get a naloxone kit, even if their son or daughter isn't using opioids, and we want them to learn how to use it. This is one of those things that is super, super powerful, super, super overwhelming, but still very important. I know that one of the, co-partners in this presentation today is Not One More Alabama. They are geared and exist for the sake of making sure that not one more child in Alabama dies as a result of an opioid overdose. And that means in part supporting the availability, distribution, and use of Narcan or naloxone to reverse an overdose and hopefully save a life. And so even if that son or daughter is not using opioids, they might have a family member who is using, a friend who's using opioids who could overdose in that parent's home, or they might be using and the parent doesn't even know it. And so having that naloxone kit is an essential element of equipping this parent as they move into this process of parenting through addiction. We want them to recognize that the focus of counseling for them is to help increase their awareness outside of the power struggle too. We want to address differences in parenting styles with a focus on increasing their decision-making and follow-through as co-parents. We want to invite them to experiment with new responses to negative and positive decisions and behaviors. So often young people who are getting in trouble with their parents who are still in that hyper controlling mode, they can do some good things and it not even get attention from their parents. The parents are so laser focused on what's going wrong that they don't even notice, acknowledge, praise, or affirm those positive decisions and behaviors. So what's the point? What's the point in continuing that? And so we want to invite parents at this stage to be deliberate about experimenting with new responses. We also want to get them into the exploration and research mode. This is part of that business of planning that the child needs them to do, even if the child's not ready. To start to explore what their own financial resources are, what the insurance benefits are, what the treatment options are for when the time comes that their son or daughter might accept that offer for help. And we want to start to help parents conceptualize crisis situations as opportunities and to develop a crisis action plan so that when that crisis comes, they're ready. And until that crisis happens, we really want to encourage them to increase the time and attention they give to taking care of themselves, protecting their other relationships, nurturing their marriage or their primary friendships. Those other relationships, including the relationship with self, so often get neglected during active addiction because a parent is so perseverating and obsessive, sound familiar, about what's going on with their child, that they don't pay attention to anything else. And so counseling with the parents is really geared towards helping them reclaim their sense of normal with other relationships. And again, inviting them to explore mutual support meetings for themselves. There will be a fork in the road. There will eventually, just like with Holly's delivery, that we know that there is an eventuality that with the disease of addiction, there will eventually be external consequences that start to happen. And that creates an opportunity that didn't exist before because the external consequences create an elevated sense of awareness. We need to help parents watch for, celebrate, and capitalize on crises instead of dreading them. They're so scared of something bad happening that they fail to appreciate that those crises can be good things. Those crises can be an opportunity. Now, I don't read Chinese, so I have no idea if this is myth or reality. But John Kennedy is quoted as having said that written in Chinese, the word crisis is composed of two characters, one that represents danger and the other that represents opportunity. So every crisis is an opportunity to invite a son or daughter to make change. And that ultimately is a good thing. Unfortunately, pain is what creates the motivation for people to move from one stage to the other. And as parents, we are hardwired to love, provide, protect, nurture, and rescue our young like every other mammal. Our instincts are to prevent pain rather than allowing it to happen. And that's where taking them back to those preschool immunizations and their determination paired with compassion is so important, because that's when they have the opportunity to move from one stage of change to the other. So I want to make a suggestion that we take a quick break here. Let's take about 5 minutes. And when we come back, we're going to talk about that movement from the delusional or pre-contemplative phase into the cherry picking, or that sort of combination of contemplation, preparation, and action that gets all murky and muddy along the way. So I see a chat here that says, apparently Amazon Prime will not let me share my video on Zoom session. So that's why I couldn't share the clip from A Beautiful Mind. I recommend and encourage you to watch A Beautiful Mind and look at it through the lens of thinking about the delusion of addiction instead of the delusions associated with the disease of schizophrenia. Both are brain diseases, both compromise the perception of reality and the ability and willingness to accept help. So it is 1:01 my time, 12:01 your time. Let's take about how about we say, let's take a 5-minute break. We'll be back here at 1:02 and we will proceed on with the next stages of change. Thank you so much, and we'll be right back. Okay, I am going to hope that most folks are back in the saddle. When you don't have to wait in line for the bathroom and wait in line for coffee, sometimes it's a little bit easier to take those short breaks. I'm going to go ahead and continue with our presentation. For those who aren't back yet, I hope they'll be joining us shortly, but we're going to stay focused. So, we were talking about, that proverbial fork in the road, that eventually there will be some external consequences that start to happen. And we want parents to be able to capitalize on that crisis and to allow their child to experience those unavoidable and uncomfortable consequences in hopes that it can create a shift into contemplation. And so as evidence mounts that using is causing problems, in part because the pain is experienced, there's a recognition of possible substance use problem by the person who's doing the using. Maybe they can begin to that idea starts to flicker a little bit, and it can only happen if the consequences are not mitigated by the rescue. So again, going back to a word picture, if I had a, one of those lawyer scales, I've got, the chains on either side, and I've got a pan over here and a pan over here. And on this side, I've got beams that represent all the reasons to keep doing the things that feel good. I've got all the reasons to keep using. But on this side of the pan, I've got the beams that represent the reason why a person might want to consider making change. And so as long as the scales are tipped in the direction of continuing to use, that person is likely to do just that. On the other hand, when the consequences and the pain start to pile up over here, the scales can start to tip. And the very nature of parenting is that because we are hardwired to rescue our children, rescue our young like every other mammal, we are prone to take beans off this side of the scale. And what we are really trying to do, help parents do, is not only watch for the opportunity for the pain to come, but not take the beans off that side of the scale, because when they do, the scale tips back the other way. So we want to help parents be able to stay the course and allow the beans to pile up on this side in hopes that those scales continue to tip, because that's going to be what creates the opportunity for their son or daughter to move from pre-contemplation or delusional thinking into contemplation. So contemplation comes about because the need to make change is driven entirely because of the desire to escape immediate distress or avoid even worse distress. So legal complications are the most natural example here. They either want to get out of jail, or they want to be, they don't want to risk going to jail. They either want to get out of suspension, or they want to avoid expulsion. They want to avoid the distress, and that creates the motivation for some sense of change, but it's mostly because they are driven by the desire for relief. Now, remember, going back to that, that image of the brain, the limbic system is in the middle, and the limbic system wants to feel good, not feel bad, as efficiently as possible. So if I say, yes, I will take this offer for treatment if it will get me out of jail, if the limbic system is driving the train, then absolutely, yes is my answer. And so it's driven by the desire to escape distress more than it is the desire for help. And so it leads to a kind of conditional acceptance or conditional willingness to make change. Even though it's progress, as they are moving into the cherry picking stage of change, they're still argumentative, arrogant, and defiant in how they will accept the help that's offered to them. Argumentative, arrogant, defiant, but more willing than they were before, which is still progress. And we want to have gratitude for the progress, but we want to keep it in perspective. They are cherry picking. So What happens for a parent when a crisis occurs is that there's an opportunity to invite that shift. And so we want parents to be prepared. Remember back when they were getting counseling when the child was in the delusional stage, we wanted them to come up with an action plan or a crisis plan. So when the crisis occurs, now is their opportunity to put that plan into action. And so they can express compassion for the distress and offer treatment services. And if they are lucky enough for their son or daughter to accept those services, they need to initiate that action plan immediately. I don't mean on Friday afternoon at 5 o'clock when it's convenient. I don't mean come the weekend or my next day off. I mean immediately. They need to get in motion and leave town with their son or daughter in less than 24 hours as soon as possible. We want them to demonstrate patience and positive affirmation if their child is receptive, but if not, just keep quiet and keep moving. Their son or daughter may be pissed as hell, but if they are willing to accept treatment, then the parent needs to stay quiet and keep moving and not agitate. Don't poke the bear. They can offer assurance that the parents will help with any loose ends. You know, it might be that they have a job and they really don't want to lose that job. Even though they know that they would lose the job anyway, at least the parent might be able to help communicate to the employee. But ultimately, the engaged parent is proceeding towards admission as promptly as possible. That is what one parent is doing as a part of that action plan. On the other hand, that parent needs a support person who's doing some other things that helps move the process along, because the engaged parent's job is to do just that: engage and transport, engage, transport, and admit. But they can't necessarily be on the phone and be negotiating things when they are engaging, transporting, and admitting. So they need somebody in the background helping them out. So that other parent or that other support person is supporting that parent's immediate engagement. They're not sabotaging it, which is really important. They are communicating with the treatment center to verify that there's a bed and initiate the admissions process. They're offering support and they're updating the treatment center about what's happening and how it's going. If that child is receptive, maybe they're offering words of affirmation to them. But again, if the child is the angry bear, then they're going to hold off on expressing those words of affirmation because they don't want to poke the bear. If there are travel arrangements that need to be made, they can do that. They can take instructions for tasks that need immediate attention. So maybe the kid says, yeah, I'll go, but only if there's a carton of cigarettes when I get there. Okay, fine. How does that parent support person make arrangements for there to be a carton of cigarettes? Does the engaged parent stop at the store and pick up those that carton of cigarettes and run the risk that the kid decides to bolt? Or does that parent support person make other arrangements? They're going to send text messages with words of encouragement and support to the other parent, and they're going to connect by phone or in person with that parent as soon as possible. Let me tell you, transporting somebody who is angry and upset and defensive and irritable to admit to treatment is emotionally and physically exhausting. One of my roles, I do a lot of different things and wear a lot of different hats. And one of them is that I am an interventionist. I use the Love First model of intervention, which includes transporting somebody to treatment. And so I'm the engaged parent in that scenario. I'm the one that's making the process keep right on moving from yes to admission. And so I'm going to be asking a parent or somebody else to be doing all those things that the parent support person is doing, because I need all of my emotional and physical and focused attention on this person and this process. I don't need any distractions. It's hard enough, but when I get there, I'm going to need support from that other person. So this is just like the action plan that my daughter and every other pregnant person has. They have a game plan for what hospital they're going to. They've got a bag packed, their time and contractions. They know where they're going. They know who their doctor is going to be. They know what is going to happen when the time comes to move into action. And so we are inviting parents to be just as focused. They don't say, oh, it's really not convenient for me to go to the hospital right now to have this baby. I'm going to wait until Friday when it's more convenient. No, we don't do it like that. We go when the time is right. And so we want to invite parents to do just that. And so as parents, as children are moving out of delusion and into cherry picking, there is some increase in insight. They do recognize that their using did cause a problem that forced them to have to do something different. But that doesn't mean they've really got full acceptance of the need for help. That comes a lot slower. And the truth of the matter is that the voice of addiction is still a constant threat. And parents have been so anxious to get to the point where their child is willing to seek help that they suddenly expect a full and unwavering surrender going forward. And I say it's so funny because it's ridiculous. It's absurd. But that's the way parents think. Oh my gosh, thankfully he finally said yes. Thankfully, we're finally getting him into some help. Thankfully, we're finally having this baby. Well, it is not the same thing because there is the torture of delivery. There is the torture of moving through the cherry picking phase of stage of change. So for parents, once there's an acceptance of help, parents expect their son or daughter to move into partnership with them. But what they really get is a cherry picker on the verge of delusion instead. They see their child accept help and make some change, but they don't really fully appreciate that cherry picking stage can sometimes last as long as 9 to 24 months, even if there's consistent engagement and recovery. So parents are still in the waiting game, and we need to help them know that. That's part of our job as counselors, is to help them know that. Parents have to be prepared for the return of ambivalence or even a regression after their son or daughter has made the decision to accept the help. And if they can recognize the signs of those stages ahead of time and have clarity about what's going on and respond to each stage in the early recovery process, the parents are less afraid, more prepared, more confident, more hopeful, and they're more effective in responding, not just reacting to their son or daughter's ambivalence. Because see, it's really easy for cherry pickers to regress when the pain of the crisis has subsided. That's why I say get out of town in 24 hours or less. From the moment that crisis is at its peak, and that parent is smart enough to throw that lifeline and say, are you ready for some help now? And the child takes that life ring. From that moment on, there is a little bit of relief for the child and a little bit of relief for the parent, and it's going to drop off fast. And as soon as the pain of that crisis has subsided, it's really easy for them to regress back into some of that delusional thinking, even if they've made some progress towards engaging in recovery. They may be advocating for early discharge, threatening to run away, refusing to follow aftercare recommendations, or insisting that parents come pick them up from treatment. We've all heard it. I'll do this, but not that. But if parents regress at the same time their children regress, it's going to backfire, because logical and rational guidance doesn't help now any more than it helped before. Emotional support doesn't feel better than the effects of the drugs. Screaming and crying doesn't work, and rewards only create willingness for short-term change to get the reward, only to resume old behavior. So if you say, if you'll stay in treatment, I'll get you a car. If you'll stay in treatment, I'll pay off your debts, or I'll pay your fine. If we use reward to keep them engaged, then they will maintain that change only for the sake of the reward, but they won't really have any motivation for meaningful, sustainable behavior change. So all parties benefit if there can be limited interaction between parent and child during this regression period. There need to be clear boundaries and clear consequences if a child self-sabotages, but they need to be communicated just clearly and calmly, not like threats. If you leave, I'm never going to speak to you again. If you leave, I'm going to let them pick you up and throw the book at you. That's not helpful. That's that emotional response that elicits more delusion and more agitation. Instead, we want to encourage them to fight the temptation to overreact. We want those parents to just clearly communicate boundaries. And I recommend the use of what I call the 4-7 rule. So what's the 4-7 rule? The 4-7 rule says, okay, so you're thinking about doing this thing. You're thinking about running away. Well, I don't know if I think that's a great idea, but do this. I understand that I can't control this decision. Do this. Sleep on it, pray on it, discuss it with other people, think about it a little bit. If in 3 or 4 days, that's still what you're thinking, we'll talk about it again. I understand you need some time to make this decision, and then drop it. Don't take the bait. Don't engage in the power struggle, because when the parent engages in the power struggle, it increases the likelihood that the delusional thinking is strengthened, that the child perceives the parent as the enemy and the drug as the friend, and moves away from the parent and back towards that delusional thinking. So we just want to encourage the parent to not engage in that power struggle, but rather just throw it out there. Think about it. We'll talk about it in a few days. Just, try not to make any decisions right now. If in 3 or 4 days you still are thinking that way, we'll discuss it again and move on and change the subject. If in 3 or 4 days they haven't run away, but they're still thinking that they want to leave early, then the parent can, again, lay out the clear consequences of what to expect and encourage them to take the next week or so to come up with a plan. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. So again, word picture that helps you conceptualize the idea of the parent role. So I don't know about you, but as a working parent, one of the things that I always did was I always volunteered for field day when my kids were in school. And so there was a time when professionals like teachers welcomed parents as helpers for special events like this. They needed the kids to have extra parents on the field to help out with the sack race or the tug of war or pass out Kool-Aid or lunches. And so those professionals welcomed parents as helpers and encouraged them to be there. And part of the reason for that is because kids would listen to parents at that stage. And so parents were helpful. But when it comes to responding to a regressing cherry picker, professionals do not want or need parent involvement. All right. What parents at the middle school level really contribute to field day is they act as a human perimeter. They simply act as a fence to keep the kids on the playing field instead of skipping school and going home. And so if a kid wanders close to the perimeter, they kick them back to the center of the playground to the coaches and the teachers that are trying to keep the kids engaged. That's exactly what happens when it comes to a son or daughter who's wanting to leave treatment or sober living. We want parents to kick them back to the center of the playground, kick them back to the treatment circle, and invite the recovery team to deliver the message. So make no mistake, the message that the recovery team may deliver could be the exact same words that the parent wants to say. But the difference is that the recovery team is not engaged in the same power struggle. And so they can maybe have a little bit more effectiveness with delivering the same message. And so they are engaged in the process of cherry picking to accept help on their terms because they don't really want it. They don't want to need it. And they want to believe that they know what they need. So they'll say, well, I'll do this, but not that. I'll stop smoking weed, but you can't expect me to stop drinking. Or I'll stop using heroin, but you're not going to take my weed away. Or fine, I'll go to those meetings, but I'm not getting a sponsor. So they want to cherry pick. I'll see a counselor, but I won't go to rehab. They want to cherry pick what they'll do, cherry pick what they think will work, because, and this is where there's that bleed over of delusion, they still really believe that they know what they need. And they're sincere when they say that. It's as if they have a complete inability to conceptualize the gravity of this brain disease. If it was a brain tumor, they wouldn't assume that they would know how to treat themselves. But because addiction is so cunning, powerful, and baffling, they don't really recognize how serious it is and how incapable they are of healing themselves. They really believe it when they say, I know what I need. They believe it and they mean it. But they are more open to hearing from those in recovery and those with whom they don't have a history of a power struggle, an experience of being shamed, guilted, or afraid. They're motivated to get relief, but because early recovery is so uncomfortable, sometimes it's really hard for them to stay committed. And so they're prone to engage in thoughts of relief-seeking behavior, but they don't always act on that. If they might be able to come to a better decision, that's where the 4-7 rule comes in, without taking risky action if they can just hold off and let that urgency for relief seeking pass. They're gonna respond better to guidance, recommendations, and encouragement from those in the recovery network, from parents and other family members. So parents, stay out of it to the degree that they possibly can. It is possible that even if there's cherry picking and ambivalence about change, every single day that the brain experiences abstinence, there is physiological healing. I don't care whether the kid is working a step or burning the book. I don't care whether a kid is honest in counseling or lying through their teeth. If they are abstaining from putting drugs and alcohol into their bodies, their brains are actively engaged in a process of physiological healing. And I don't care what keeps them there. So, behavioral problems can still persist during the cherry picking stage, but if there's enough willingness to stay engaged, if parents have the resources to provide for that long-term engagement and can be patient with the process, and their behaviors aren't necessarily a threat to the long-term, to the safety of the recovery community, sustainable change without relapse can actually happen. It's fascinating to recognize that if somebody simply stays clean and sober long enough, their thinking can improve simply as a function of abstinence. Now, make no mistake, we want them to do some deep, insightful work. We want them to take more responsibility and be able to see more of a causal relationship between their actions and consequences. But as long as they're staying clean and sober, their brain is healing, and that is so important. If they can sustain that abstinence for over a year, they can actually naturally transition into the partnership stage of change with their recovery team and their parents. They can actually decide that those people actually are on their team. They want them on their team. They believe that they have their self-interest, their own interest at heart. And so sometimes if we can get through that first year without a relapse, even if there are behavior problems, the brain heals enough for a son or daughter to move into partnership. It doesn't happen all the time, but when it does, it is a beautiful thing to behold. I have had the opportunity of working with some programs where I've seen it over and over again. Even though we talk about relapsing into a return to use being a part of the recovery process, it doesn't always happen. And when it doesn't, and a family can progress into recovery together, it is a beautiful thing to behold. But we know that it doesn't always work out that way. We know that there can be dramatic hints at regression back into delusion. And when that happens, Parents of cherry pickers need to stay committed to their self-care and their own recovery work and working with their own professionals. They need to keep working on words of affirmation and willingness towards their kids and affirming their perseverance even when it's hard. Those words of affirmation, even if it's, I'm so proud of you for staying the course. I know it's really hard. Even if that's the only thing they can say they're proud of, they need to be able to say that because the kids need to be able to hear it. Again, whether they're 17 or 47. The enthusiastic sobriety community encourages parents to try to limit their words to short responses. That's because they know that young people in early stages of recovery are not very receptive to long dialogue, long lectures, even words of affirmation. And so they encourage them to say cool, wow, and bummer for everything that happens. You know, when things go well, cool, glad to hear it. When you hear something dramatic, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, and you just don't know how to respond, you can say, wow. Or the bummer response, I got fined for a dirty drug test, or I got fined because I didn't do my chore, bummer. Now, some young people really don't respond well to bummer. And so I would encourage parents to extend that one word bummer to 6 words of, oh, I'm so sorry. That's a bummer. Or, oh, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry that happened. I think that shorter responses are still good for cherry pickers. They need to stay in their lane and fight the temptation to fall back into old behaviors. Instead, defer to counselors, recovery community, and sponsors whenever possible. They need to avoid reacting much at all to those threats of impulsive reaction. And again, encourage the 4-7 rule. Avoid making threats of action in response to negative decisions, and clarify simply what they are willing to support. And so there's a difference in saying what they are willing to support and what the threats are if they make a negative decision. So when I talk about what they're willing to support, it's things like, well, I know this is your decision. I just want to be sure you understand that my money stays with the program. My money doesn't follow you. If you decide to leave, you'll need to take responsibility for figuring out where you're going to live, how you're going to get there, because my money goes to support your services and care. And if you decide to leave care, I can accept that that's your decision to make, but my money won't follow you wherever you go. I just want to be sure you understand. My love will follow you. I will love you wherever you are, but my money won't follow you. So you may want to think about that. Because the truth of the matter is, young people are so accustomed to their parents providing for them, even when they're making bad decisions, that they are inclined to assume that parents will continue their old pattern of rescue. And so what we're wanting to see happen is for parents to clarify what they're willing to support and accept that they may not be able to control that child's decision. Again, 17 to 47 or 67. We want to encourage them to keep the focus on taking one day at a time and learning from other people. And be prepared to let consequences of self-sabotage occur as quickly as possible. The sooner the consequence can happen, the more likely the son or daughter is to experience that re-motivation to re-engage in services. But the wait could be long. Relapses are common, but a full-scale return to delusion is not a guarantee. We just know that for some people, it's hard to know what it'll take. What is that proverbial bottom that seems so elusive and beyond the comprehension of so many parents? I had worked with a family whose son lost his eye as a result of an incident that happened when he was impaired, but that wasn't it. I had a son who was in jail for 4 months, but that wasn't it. I had a son who, not my own son, the son of a family I was working with, who total lost his car in an alcohol-related accident, but that wasn't it. We never know what it's going to be. For the son who lost his eye, for him, it was being in jail. For the son who'd been in jail for 4 months, it was when his family went to the beach without him. For the son who total lost his car, it was facing felony cocaine possession charges, not the loss of the car. We don't know what that proverbial bottom is going to be. And parents don't know either. And we've got to be able to be prepared to support those parents and in that engaged waiting game. Because true willingness to follow directions really occurs only because somebody gets exhausted and eventually surrenders after multiple failures of doing it my way. True willingness to follow only comes when they finally accept that their way isn't working. When defiance gives way to exhaustion, genuine willingness can follow. We see this especially with those affected by addiction to heroin, opioids, crack cocaine, and meth. Arguably, those are the most addictive drugs available, and repeated overdoses are common when somebody has been in this cycle of back and forth between delusion and cherry picking, never making their way all the way into partnership because they've been so defiant. And when defiance gives way to exhaustion, good things can happen, but it comes as a result of lots and lots of bad things. Desperation and fear have become so all-consuming that a kind of humble, exhausted, almost pitiful defeat can be observed by the person with addiction. This is often after years and years of half-hearted engagement with recovery. And then there comes a point where there's sincere engagement and they fail anyway. Before they were half-heartedly engaged, but when there was serious engagement and they really meant it and they still failed, that's what happens that creates the circumstance that somebody gets really scared. When somebody finally concedes to following the recommendations and genuinely tries but still relapses, they start to get really afraid that they may be incapable of getting well. Which brings me to a little pet peeve, I must say. If you've ever been to a 12-step meeting, there's a part of most 12-step meetings where they read a section out of the big book called How It Works. And one of the lines in How It Works is that some of us are constitutionally incapable of following a program of rigorous honesty. When people hear some of us are constitutionally incapable, they stop listening to the rest about rigorous honesty. What that says is some of us are too sick to get well. And when somebody actually reaches the point where they honestly try and they fail again, if they've participated in 12-step recovery off and on all these years, those words, some of us are constitutionally incapable, ring like a death knell. It scares them to death. Maybe that's me. Maybe I can't get well. And so there's a kind of humble, exhausted, pitiful defeat and great fear that maybe they can't get well. And that distress and exhaustion creates a genuine readiness for partnership and includes inviting everybody in their recovery team into partnership. They finally have come to accept that they don't really know what it is that's best for them. They're finally open to suggestions by counselors, sponsors, recovering peers, old timers, and yes, even parents. They demonstrate openness to suggestion. And this is one of the ways you can tell that somebody has moved into partnership. They start asking other people what they would recommend or what they think about a situation. That didn't happen when they were in cherry picking because they were arrogant. They thought they had all the answers. Remember, they're developmentally stuck in adolescence for a long time, no matter how old they are. And so they can start to demonstrate a willingness to do things that are different than what they wanted to based on the guidance from other people. I really want to do this. but my sponsor says I probably shouldn't do that, so I'm going to listen to my sponsor. Eureka! How did this happen? This is freaking miraculous. We really want and need our children to be able to get to partnership, but we never know how long it's going to take for them to get there. They're able to verbalize emotions, and if they know what happened, they might even be able to explain what happened that caused them to return to use. And they're able to invite others to join them in making decisions about their recovery, their next steps, or their needs for fewer or more services. Yeah, I think I need to have that recovery coach when I leave sober living. I'm ready to move into independent living, but I think having that recovery coach would be a good idea instead of just putting me out there, going to meetings and all on my own. That kind of receptivity and that kind of openness to those kinds of decisions is a product of being in the partnership stage of change. Parents in this stage still need a lot of support, but there's a new kind of relief for them. They've learned a lot. These people, the parents who have finally made it to a partnership stage of change, this is not their first rodeo. They've learned a lot, and they learn to never rescue again, and their kids know it by now. They're actively engaged in living their lives. In fact, a lot of times they've already done their grieving. They have grieved the likelihood of an overdose because of a disappearance or previous overdoses. They have grieved the possibility that they may lose their children, and they're trying to figure out how to move on. Their sons and daughters, on the other hand, in partnership, are demonstrating a new kind of humility and a willingness to go to any lengths in the pursuit of recovery. And that feels really good to them. It feels different. They haven't seen that before. And so even if there are other relapses, the relapses tend to be brief, less frequent, and followed by immediate re-engagement back to recovery supports. Parents and their recovering child have reset their expectations, and they prioritize living rather than achievement. Staying alive rather than achieving becomes the top priority. There are new benchmarks for defining progress and reasons for encouragement. And while they're still scared to hope or exhale or believe, that dynamic of collaboration gives parents and their child new reasons to feel encouraged. Even though these parents are old pros, parents still need to encourage them in the partnership stage to stay focused on taking care of themselves and engaging with their tribe, to routinely express words of affirmation for progress and recovery to their sons and daughters, and to express gratitude for the new kind of partnership and openness that we have together. To demonstrate that they can handle the truth even when it hurts. So think about that line from A Few Good Men when Jack Nicholson screams at Tom Cruise and he says, "You can't handle the truth." Well, parents in the partnership stage can handle the truth. Their son or daughter can tell them, "Yeah, I messed up. I did this, but I went back the next day. I picked up a white chip. I'm doing the thing. I'm really sorry, but I got back on the horse as quickly as I could." Those parents in partnership stage have progressed to the place where they can handle the truth even when it hurts. They offer solutions only when asked, and even then, only after having heard their son or daughter's ideas and thoughts. They reiterate the 4-7 rule all along the way, and they're willing to model it by doing it themselves. And even if a return to use happens, it's possible for this family to know that they can use this collaboration and partnership to avoid regressing into their old patterns of negative behavior. Parents do have power, just not the power they want. Parents do not have power to control their children's choices, friend group, behavior, beliefs. They can't prevent addiction from developing. They can't protect their children or change their children or create their recovery. They do not have the power to change the way their children feel about their parenting decisions. That is power that they want, that they do not have. But they do have power that they don't necessarily want. They don't want to have the power, but they do have the power to fuel powerful feelings of shame, guilt, unworthiness, and self-hatred in their children by how they respond to their children's behavior. They do have the power to set limits, hold boundaries, and maintain the sanctuary of their own home, even if that means having to insist that their son or daughter live somewhere else. They do have the power to hold their children responsible for their actions, and they do have the ability to learn. They have the ability to learn about addiction, treatment, aftercare, and their role in the recovery process. Parents do have power. It's just not always power they want to have to use, or power that they fully appreciate, like this business of the ability to fuel those terrible feelings that sabotage recovery and sabotage children's self-concepts. Because recovery from the effects of a brain disease is such a slow process, parents are in a perpetual state of waiting. They're waiting to find out from the very beginning, is this just a phase or is this really addiction? What's it going to take for him to accept help? How bad does it have to get? Will he stay in treatment or sober living long enough to get well? Is she committed to recovery, or is she just going through the motions? Do they really want this for themselves, or are they just trying to avoid consequences or make me happy? How many more times are we going to have to do this? Can he do it without Suboxone? Could this be the treatment program that finally cracks the code and makes the difference? Will she really stay the course this time? Is this horror movie actually over? They are constantly waiting for answers to questions like these and so many others. Which begs the obvious question: when is it simply too dangerous to wait? So I told you earlier, I promised I'd come back to this. Sometimes it's simply too dangerous to wait. So let's talk about when to wait and when to intervene and what intervention really looks like. In general, I would encourage parents to wait if there's no heroin, crack, meth, or IV drug use. If there's no other life-threatening behaviors. If there's no history of suicide attempts. So let's be clear, suicidal threats are not the same thing as suicide attempts. The best predictor of a suicide attempt is a past suicide attempt. And so if a child has threatened but not taken action, that has quite possibly been more a matter of manipulation rather than serious suicide intent. And so if there has been a history of an attempt, that's a game changer. But if there's been no history of an attempt, I might suggest they wait and hold off until there's more readiness. If they've had some prior treatment or they know something about 12-step engagement, they've got some information, they're no longer ignorant, wait to see if they can engage with those resources on their own. If there's no indication of readiness and none of these other things are happening, I might recommend they wait. If there are no minor children, aging parents, or others whose everyday safety is threatened, it might be good to wait. And if the parents' distress tolerance skills are improving and generally successful, then maybe we wait. Maybe we wait and don't intervene. When I say intervention, you heard me mention before that I use a love first model of intervention. And so one form of intervention is literally a structured family intervention, whether that is with the help of someone from the AA community, whether that is a professional interventionist who uses an ARISE model or a love first model or a Johnson Institute model, or a dude, you need to go with me, get in the car. That could be as simple as it gets in terms of having a meaningful intervention in a way that brings in a third party to help initiate the movement from one stage of change to another. On the other hand, there are other forms of intervention: the willingness to press charges, the willingness to inform a probation officer of violations, the willingness to pursue involuntary commitment. If you're in Florida or a state that has the Marchman Act, the willingness to pursue commitment on grounds of addiction being dangerous to self. There are different kinds of intervention, and there are times when it's simply too dangerous to wait. So if there's heroin, crack, meth, or any IV drug use, I might suggest going ahead with intervention, because when somebody is to the place where they are using that frequently, then they may not be able to have the ability to gain the self-awareness while they're continuing to use. So we talk about there being moments of clarity. In order for there to be a moment of clarity, for that moment of distress where they throw the lifeline and they take it and say yes, there has to be a break. There has to be a break. I once had a man who came to me and said, "Jenny, you got to get me in. I got to come in. I got to get to treatment. You got to help me." I said, "Okay, can you see me at 3 o'clock?" He said, "Yes, I'll be there." 20 minutes into the session, he said, "Hold on. I got to go hit this rock. I'll be right back. I want to go to treatment, but you got to let me go hit this rock. I promise I'll come back." He gets up, he leaves my office, he drives down the street, he goes and hits that crack cocaine rock, comes back 10 minutes later, we continue the conversation, we get him into treatment that day. This was a 50-some-year-old man who had lots of treatment experience. He was able to get himself there, but the frequency of his using was so close together, he couldn't even meet with me for an hour without having to leave. So when somebody gets to the place where their using is that close together, there's a possibility that they might not be able to have that moment of clarity, and intervention may be necessary. If there's been a history of suicide attempts in response to despair, when we are allowing the despair to build up and we know they have attempted suicide in the past, we may need to intervene. If there are other life-threatening behaviors that occur while they're using, like playing with guns or driving 100 miles an hour, then intervention may be necessary. If others in the household are in danger, if I've got a son who's selling drugs out of my house and I have a 2-year-old in the next room, and I know that my son is having kids come in and out of my house in the middle of the night with my 2-year-old in the bed next door, in the next door bedroom, I may need to intervene just to protect the safety of my 2-year-old. Or if they are simply unable to gain self-awareness because they are so sick, it may be necessary to intervene. With our help as professionals, parents can become acutely aware to recognize cues and adjust accordingly. When a son or daughter is delusional, they can limit their words, express their emotions elsewhere for support and guidance, allow consequence, and hold on tight. When their son or daughter is cherry picking, they can limit their words to words of affirmation for progress and perseverance, limit reactions or threats to threats and impulsivity, avoid power struggle at all costs, and defer to those in recovery. And when in partnership, they can know to have gratitude, demonstrate the ability to tolerate uncomfortable truths, and offer ideas while still deferring the decision back to their son or daughter. They can figure out where their son or daughter is. Are they delusional? Are they cherry picking? Are they in partnership? And they can adjust their responses accordingly when they know how to tell the difference. So tell the truth. How many of you disagreed with me when I showed this slide? Nothing you can do, Mom. Go to Al-Anon, wait for them to hit bottom. Now, I hope you believe that there really are things that parents can do to help the process of change and to parent through addiction towards recovery. I'm going to stop my screen share and invite Q&A. Ashley, can you help me with that? Are there thoughts, questions, comments about this idea of children moving, and again, children of all ages moving back and forth from delusion to cherry picking to partnership and back and forth on a continuum until we hope one day they can get to partnership and stay there.
All right, so far we haven't had many questions. So if y'all have questions, if you'll just drop them in the Q&A or the chat box. Sometimes they get a little lost in the chat box. So if you could just put them in the Q&A. And then I also just put the link to the evaluation in the chat box as well. You did such a great job, Jenny. Nobody has any questions yet.
You know, it's hard to be in a circumstance where you can't gauge the reactions of the participants. And so this is just a subject that I feel really passionately about. And parents so often are inclined to think, and professionals are inclined to tell them, there's nothing you can do. And I think there's a lot of things that we can do. Somebody asked if you can share my contact information. As far as I'm concerned, you can share the slides. Because it really is a drink with a fire hose. And I know I'm giving people a lot of information. Parenting Through Addiction is a great resource that counselors can both use for their own benefit as well as refer parents. It is not limited to state lines because it is not therapy. It is a combination of education, support, and inspiration. Some parents may choose for some consultations. So I'm going to answer this question from an anonymous attendee. Parenting Through Addiction is not therapy, so it is available across state lines. So the question is, when you say children, I just want to make sure you're talking about young adults, legal age and older, especially when you're speaking about the areas to intervene or not intervene. So I think the short answer is it kind of depends. I think that there is a reality of residential treatment and outpatient treatment for adolescents that a parent can be the one to sign a kid in. But when we talk about substance use, as that is a protected class for people 14 and older. And so 14 and older, federal law says they have the right to sign their own consent and can sign themselves out of treatment if they are 14 and older without parental consent. If they are experiencing substance use, need family planning, or need treatment for a sexually transmitted disease, federal law says they can make those decisions for themselves. And so while, yes, a parent may want to and have the right to sign their child into treatment, a 14-year-old and up can opt out under the bounds of the law. And that's a hard and bitter pill for parents to swallow. How do you know that you are living with a functional user? So, you know, the DSM has changed now where we recognize the moderate substance use disorder as opposed to simply abuse or dependency. And I think that is a recognition of what we used to call a functional alcoholic or a functional addict. And so my description of that is that a person who has a functional level of addiction, by the way, the DSM code for moderate and severe is the same as the old DSM code for dependency. So it is recognized as addiction. It's just a more functional level of addiction. And so generally those folks experience an ability to fulfill many of their personal responsibilities, but at the same time, they experience illness, injury, and damaged relationships. And so that's where we see the impact of the addiction hurting them. Is it makes them sick, they get hurt, or their relationships are complicated. Interestingly, we used to see the progression. We used to assume there would be progression. I'm not sure that's always true. And in fact, the new DSM doesn't necessarily endorse the idea that if you have a moderate level of addiction, that you will necessarily progress to a severe level of addiction if you keep using. What I think is true is that the consequences of illness, injury, and damaged relationships get more severe, which might motivate somebody to make some changes. Any other thoughts, questions, comments?
Yeah, so there's actually a really good question. Let me scroll back up to it. Okay. It was, as a parent, when someone has struggled over and over, what do parents do after several overdoses?
So, I think one of the things that, so first of all, I'm a huge believer in Narcan, and I realize there's some people that feel like it's a little bit of a crutch, and we've all heard stories about Narcan parties and all of that. But what I think is true is that even though harm reduction strategies are hard for some of us that's a bitter pill for us to swallow sometimes. I think harm reduction may be necessary to keep somebody alive so that they have an opportunity for recovery. And so if a parent has a child who has experienced numerous overdoses, I would make sure that they have multiple doses of Narcan at their disposal. They make sure their son or daughter has Narcan at their disposal, and they maintain a connected but detached relationship. So that seems like an oxymoron. What I mean by that is I wouldn't want them to live in our house. I wouldn't want to be financially supporting them unless they're in a recovery environment, but I would want to maintain a relationship. So let's just say they're actively heroin using, actively frequently overdosing, then I would be an advocate to say, I'll meet you once a week for dinner at your favorite restaurant. And if you're there, we'll enjoy the time together. And if you're not there, I will enjoy the meal without you. But it creates the opportunity for them to provide one good meal, because mothers feel bad about not feeding their babies, because we're like every other mammal. We want to feed our children. And so we feed our children once a week. We have an opportunity to lay eyeballs on them and to see, how bad do they look? How much better are they? Could it be that they're hanging in there? Could it be that this is the time that they say, I know I said I didn't want help, but I think I do want help. But if we don't create the opportunity for that occasional connectedness, we might not have an opportunity to hear that. And so I am an advocate for staying connected, but not enabling, and making sure that the chronic overdoser always has access to Narcan. And if they use it, let me get you another one. Because if they don't stay alive, they don't have a chance at recovery.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for answering those questions. Let's see, we are out of time. So if Jenny, if you could please just send me the slides, I'll get those out to folks. And then I will also send you all a follow-up email. Then I have the slides, the link to the recording, and then also the link to Jenny's book and to her website as well.
So all I ask as far as the slides, I'm happy to share them. I would just ask people that if they want to use that information, that they not claim it as their own. That's all I ask.
Yes, that's a good trade-off right there.
All right.
Thank you so much. Thank you. We appreciate you.
Y'all have a good rest of your week. I'm going to go see my grandbaby.